Oh, good evening. Thank you for being here. It's nice to see you all. My name is Steve Yoshimura. I'm the chair of the Department of Communication Studies here at the University of Montana, and this is the third annual Steve Schwarze Memorial Lecture. For those of you who don't know, Steve is a late friend and colleague of ours who specialized in environmental rhetoric. Whether he was dealing with coal companies or asbestos mining companies in Libby, Montana, his work illuminated both the experience and expression of environmental messages, showing us how our lives are deeply impacted by the ways in which environmental issues are framed by those who hold power in the public sphere. This lecture is funded by the Schwarze family, to whom we are tremendously grateful for the gift and the ability to remember our friend and colleague. We're also grateful to Missoula Community Access Television for being here and granting us the ability to live stream and record this event, and to share it broadly with people who could not be here with us in person tonight. The event is part of a media assistance grant donated by AMCAT. We also thank Dining Services and the Badlander for being here tonight to host a reception that will follow the event. And with that, I am honored to introduce you to Dr. Eean Grimshaw. Dr. Grimshaw earned his PhD from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, but after completing his MA here at the University of Montana in the Department of Communication Studies. He also has a BA in Native American Studies from the University of Montana. As a communication scholar, he is interested in ethnographic approaches to studying how culture and communication intersect, often through the perspectives of cultural discourse analysis. At the heart of his work is a curiosity of how things like identity and place and action, feeling, and relationships are built through communication, and how those meanings are shared and valued within different communities. He's especially drawn to ways in which people express these ideas in intercultural and cross-cultural settings. His most recent research includes two lines of focus. One strand extends his dissertation work looking at Native American communication and culture, including a project on Blackfeet, Amskapi Pikuni. Thank you. I had to practice that one. As expressed through Native American Speaks program in Glacier National Park. The other examines the rise of politicians and presidential candidates on late-night talk shows. Sounds very timely. Leading up to the 2016 general election and the 2018 Democratic primaries, which culminated in a co-authored book titled Politicians at Night. In preparation for his talk, Eean has begun a new line of research, which aims in part to explore the ways in which the Yurok, Klamath, Karuk, and Hupa peoples successfully argued over the course of 20 years for the removal of 4 dams on the Klamath River. He's equally interested in what it means for salmon runs, environmental restoration, and the sovereignty of indigenous peoples. As an assistant professor at Oregon Tech, Dr. Grimshaw now teaches within view of the headwaters of the Klamath River near the shores of Lake Ewanna. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eean Grimshaw.
Okay. Oh, much louder. All right. Thank you, Steve. All right. Okay. So thank you so much, Steve, and the rest of the communication department, as well as the University of Montana, for having me out here for this wonderful event. I started my undergraduate education back here in 2007, and so this is very much a full circle moment for me. Last time I was here was in 2019 when I was beginning my dissertation fieldwork up in Glacier National Park, and I stayed at Steve's house in the backyard in the tree house. 6 years later, I couldn't imagine a greater honor and opportunity to talk about the kind of research I think Steve would have loved to hear about. Steve was much more than just my master's advisor, and when I got my first assistant professor job in 2021, Steve was the first person I told, and he was ecstatic for me. He was also there for me in ways that most of you are probably unaware. I recently lost my mother at the end of July after a long battle with breast cancer. When I was working on my PhD in Massachusetts, me and Steve kept in touch about how all of that was going with him and with Mom. I know both of them are here with us today, and any tears shed are only done so in love of both of them. Before going any further, I want to acknowledge that we're on Salish land here at the University of Montana, and this is one of my favorite photos from the Mansfield Center stacks, the resources, right? And it's a great photo to demonstrate the importance of the kind of work that I do, the kind of relationships that has with the tribes in the state. But also, I think it's really important to say and show this before I get into the context of the research that I've been working on recently. Which kind of brings us to this, and again, the title of my talk today is Reclaiming the River. And I'm okay with some of the words in there. We'll get to some of that later, and maybe you can help me out with thinking through some of that. But what we're going to talk about today is the effort of these 4 tribes to their undertaking to the largest dam removal in the world. 4 dams off of the Klamath River over a 20-year battle, at least legally speaking, a 20-year battle. It goes on before that. And I'm interested particularly in some of the discourses that have been surrounding this conversation over time. We'll back up a little bit in time. I promise not to do too much of that, but I want to set the context, the historical setting of what's really going on here. It also should hopefully go without saying that any mistakes I make in my presentation are mine alone, and anything that is remotely correct is attributed to everything everybody else has taught me. Okay. So tonight, I want to talk in part about the effort to remove these 4 dams from the Klamath River. Okay. Now, Klamath Falls is here, actually where Oregon Tech is. That's where I live. And I moved to Oregon Tech in 2023, which is actually when the first of these dams, I believe this one right here, number 2, was removed. Okay. The other 3 were all removed in the last year. But what originally kind of drew me to this project in part was I teach public speaking. One of the first speeches we give is a local issue speech. Thanks, Steve, for that. And they talked about how Lake Ewanna, which is basically right there by Klamath, is not safe for recreation. Okay, the toxic algal blooms that happen there every year make it unsafe to go in physically. There are warnings plastered around the lake that you shouldn't let your pets in there. If they drink it, they have a chance of passing away or, host of diseases, host of problems, okay? And so my students started to tell me about this project, about what was going on, and I went, oh, this is really interesting. I'm going to start to dig into this, okay? It gets better because as Steve reached out to me about the opportunity to come out here and give this lecture, one of the things that he and me started talking about was how in Steve's own research, he started to focus on the winners rather than the bad guys. And so I was like, there's a good ending to this. So let's run with that and see what we can do. A couple other things to point out before we go any further. This is roughly the area, the traditional lands of the Yurok tribe. The Hupa and the Karuk are mostly from this area. And then the Klamath, which is actually, their reservation is a confederation of tribes that were put together, is right up here closer to Klamath. Okay? And it's the efforts of those 4 tribes together in concert, in addition to farmers, to fishermen, both commercial and, sport, that all came together in order to really make this happen. These are the 4 dams themselves. J.C. Boyle's at the top. Copco 2 is the first one that they removed because it was the smallest. Okay? And somewhat in total, I've got it written down a little bit later. There's lots of water back there. Okay. So I'm interested in not only the 20-year battle to get to this point, okay, but also what this might mean for the tribes themselves specifically, for salmon runs and salmon harvests. We'll talk about the Klamath tribe actually does, it's the Yurok tribe does a salmon festival every year in September. 2 years ago, they asked themselves whether or not they would be serving barbecue chicken at their salmon festival because there weren't enough salmon in the river to harvest. Any other salmon they'd fly in from Alaska. Okay, so I'm interested in that, also what this means for indigenous sovereignty, but there's also some really cool things going on here with environmental restoration, energy production, and so my talk tonight in part is work in progress, and I hope that some of what I share with you sparks ideas in you that you can then share with me, and we can have a nice dialogue at the end of all of this. Okay. So this is in part of the movement. You can see here they've got nasty water. Okay. Okay. So where am I at? Sorry. Okay. So bit of historical context. Okay. In 1906, the first dam irrigation project began on the Klamath River. Okay. The original dams were put in place primarily for irrigation and energy production. Okay. Although over the years their energy production got really, really low and was not really that big of an economic benefit. And by 1930s, the salmon were basically completely extinct from what they consider to be the upper basin. The dams had prevented their ability to reach all their spawning grounds, and I don't think any of them had, what do they call them? Fish steps, right? Fish elevators, okay? So all of this coincided with the construction of Copco 1, which is this guy, okay? And that began producing hydroelectric power in 1918. Copco 2 was completed in 1925, resulting in the dewatering of 1.7 miles of historical river channels. The later two dams further reduced accessible fish habitat almost entirely. The tribes did challenge their fishing ban that had previously been placed on them a little bit later on, but the court essentially ruled you can fish, but there are no fish because there's no river. That ends up getting to a little bit stuff that we'll jump to in a bit. Okay. So, anybody know what this is? Or reckon a guess? It's a fish kill. Okay. This happened in 2001, in the summer of 2001, late September. Okay. It was a drought year. The water was already very, very low. And what little water they did have, they diverted and let out primarily for farmers. Okay. This led to what some argue to be perhaps the largest fish kill in the West. Okay, an estimated 33,000 to 70,000 salmon, coho, steelhead were dead in the river, primarily due to toxic algal blooms because the water was so low and it wasn't moving. It was also very hot. Okay, and it gets really messy. This is a picture of salmon with gill rot. Okay, this also breeds a host of bacteria that spread. And I was watching or reading something last night that said when the water often gets that low, the fish are then basically on top of one another, and so the transmission rates are just through the roof. Here we've got our lovely toxic algal blooms, and I believe this is actually from Copco Lake, Copco Lake 2. The residents on that lake wanted to keep the dams, despite the fact that they are unsafe to recreate in, because they didn't want to lose their lakefront property. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, so okay, so just to back that up, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service linked the killed water diversions to farmers Gilrot. For the quantitative scholars out there, I have some numbers. Okay, so flows were previously recorded of around 800 cubic feet per second in 1908 before any irrigations were put on the river. And that dropped down to roughly 475 after the dams were put in place. It was arguably much lower than that when they suffered the fish kill in 2001. Okay? Now this ends up being a major turning point of sorts, okay? Because at the same time that the fish kill happens is when all the licenses for the dams are up, okay? Which means the private company which owns these dams, PacifiCorp, now has to weigh whether or not it is worth refurbishing these dams, bringing them up to standard so that the new licenses can be upheld and they can continue energy production, or if they actually want to remove the dams. It turned out it was actually less money to remove the dams than to upgrade them to new technology. Okay? And so even though PacifiCorp pursued this for a while, they even eventually agreed that it wasn't in their best interest, and so they even kind of get on board. Okay? So this all happens, and this allows the private owners of the dam to engage in dialogue with farmers, tribes, fishermen, arguing that essentially if they don't remove the dams, all of these fish will disappear. There will be no more harvests, and this, if we go back, nope. If we think about the total route of the river, right, it's impacting people from the headwaters all the way down to the coast. And so even though the Yurok are most concerned because they're right there where the salmon are, this is also a problem, of course, that goes backwards. Okay. Proponents argued for removing the dams because of the algal blooms, which impact tribal subsistence, but also fishing more generally. Yes, perfect. Okay. One of the things, is this a good place to put this? This is not to say that there weren't people at that time who did not necessarily want to remove the dams. As I mentioned previously, there were people on Copco Lake, a lake that is only created because of the dam, who didn't want it let down. There were also concerns about how to necessarily share the water, but they eventually agreed that it was a big enough problem that this was something that they needed to tackle cooperatively. This leads to eventual agreements between basically all parties that something needs to be done. Okay? They don't necessarily agree on how to handle it, and the big thing that they disagree about is actually restoration efforts. They all agree that the water needs to be, that the dams need to come out and the water needs to be allowed to recover and revive itself. But PacifiCorp, of course, doesn't want to be on the line for the bill. Okay? And so the early agreements that they come up with are the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, KBRA, and the Klamath Hydropower Settle Agreement. The first, which would do investments in restoration, the second, which would support the removals. Okay? And that's supported by the 2013 Department of Interior report that would not only aid the native peoples, but basically everybody involved. Okay? So they're all on board. This, of course, is something that also requires both states to work because it's an Oregon problem and it's a California problem. And they reach agreements, okay? Unfortunately, it doesn't pass Congress. Okay, they can't get it through Congress in time, and so it gets kicked back out, and as a result, the new KHSA set up a private nonprofit to oversee the removal of the dams, basically saying we're just going to transfer ownership so that we can deal with this without the government having to be involved, okay? Or at least to a lesser degree, okay? And that was funded in part by PacifiCorp as well as California Prop 1 in order to establish that. There's basically a lot of legal things that happen in the courts over the next handful of years. It's really not interesting to get into that. And so I think it's probably better to just jump forward to what happens when they finally agree and start to demolish the dams. Okay? That doesn't happen, like I said, until 2023 with the first one. Okay? And so this is Copco 2 before and after. believe this is Iron Gate, before and after. J.C. Boyle, this is the highest of the dams. And here's a little side-by-side of a couple of them at the same time. In full, the removal will release nearly 170 billion liters of water. It will unlock 300 to 400 miles of fish habitat. There are plans to reseed that area with over 16 billion seeds, including over 100 native species across 22,000 acres of land previously hidden by all the water. Okay. The cascading events of this project and the dam's removals are huge and wide-reaching. It's argued that everything will benefit from this. There are, of course, concerns, and I want to address at least a couple of those. One of the big ones being, what's going to happen with all the sediment and everything that's been sitting in these dams for all these years? It's full of toxic bacteria, okay? And as they flush out each of the dams in order to then go to removal, there was a lot of concerns with, well, what's that going to do to the river? And in the immediate aftermath, it made the river worse, right? But it's going to slowly push all of that out, okay? Now, this was a big concern that a lot of people had entering this agreement, okay? Thankfully, there are a couple examples to look at and draw from in order to address some of these concerns. And this is all from USGS, I believe, okay? And so they suspect that 1 year post-dam removal, there will be significant sediment movement out into estuary areas. The quality of that sediment will be better than it previously was, okay? And that this is only bound to continue to improve as time goes on. There's a lot of positive hope, I think, with this, okay? And I'm not necessarily going to go so far as to say that this is the perfect model for other kinds of projects, okay? I think there are enough complexities in this case, and there's a whole thing about Indian law that we didn't even touch that fits in here. And yet I am hopeful and optimistic, okay? The example that I'm talking about is the Elwha River up in the peninsula, and that was removed back in 2011, okay? And what they found several years later was that it actually created estuary land that they were unexpecting. And that was something that wasn't in the calculations, it wasn't in the predictions, it wasn't in the timetable. And I think that this case, if we think back to the Klamath River, has some really interesting implications. Okay? And this is kind of where I want to get to, and this is kind of where we actually get to the cool stuff. Okay? So this is, of course, the reseeding. We also have this lovely project. It's called The First Descent. Okay, a group of indigenous, primarily Klamath, Karuk, Yaruk, and Hoopa peoples, okay, just completed the first descent from mouth to sea of the Klamath River, post-dam removals. Okay, and so there's a lovely documentary that they've done. It's also my understanding that this is a traditional Yurok canoe, okay? And so it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out and what happens, okay? The main things that I've been playing with in this project, okay, is what this means for land back, what this means for discourses of fishing, and I guess recreation kind of by conjuncture, what this means for water, indigenous sovereignty, environmental restoration. This is going to be a really interesting thing to keep your eye on over the next X years. They're finally gone, and now it's really an amazing opportunity to see what that project looks like moving forward, what that means for salmon fishing both commercially and in subsistence ways. The land back thing, for me, I think is perhaps maybe the most important piece. And when I say that, my interest there is in removing these dams, you've opened up all this previously inaccessible river. You've also opened up a ton of land that was previously hidden under all of that. That land is in direct ownership or care of the Klamath Tribes Agreement, which they all came into coalition to sign. And so that's going to be taken care of in a good way, in a right way, okay? The other piece of that I think is equally interesting and awesome is the fact that that's now also creating estuary land that nobody essentially planned for. You're doing land back with land that was previously inaccessible. And I think that's doing a very perhaps interesting thing in indigenous spaces as indigenous peoples, indigenous nations are getting their land back, okay, in various ways across the country. And I think it's really interesting to see that in a kind of way that I really hadn't thought about it, okay? The fishing thing I think is really interesting because if we back up to 2001 and the fish kill, that's essentially what sets this off, is that commercial fishers are also banned from fishing. And when they can't fish, they lose their livelihoods, right? They lose their livelihoods, the indigenous peoples have lost their connection to their culture, and so now everybody's on board. Now there's a uniting force, and so I'm interested in what this kind of idea of fishing means in different ways to different people, but there's got to be fish to fish, and there's got to be a river to fish from, right? And so those kind of interconnections, and I think, of course, that discourse can probably be disputed and thought about in a lot of different ways, okay? But I think that there's definitely something there. Steve, you know how we're doing on time? Okay. The other thing, and I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, it's the reclaiming the Klamath River. There's restore, there's revival. There's a lot of interesting words being thrown around there in terms of what's going to happen to that area. And I will be interested in seeing what grabs hold and what people kind of run with going forward. Is this a renewal? Some people were even calling it a revival of the river. And again, I think there's perhaps something really interesting going on there. As somewhat of a nice, positive ending to this, okay? This is a photograph of the first Chinook salmon in the Klamath River Basin for the last 100 years. This was taken last October. And I think that's just awesome. And I think that, in part, is where I would like to end at least my part of the lecture, because that's the kind of positivity that I hope you can take away from this. I hope that in the world that we're currently living in, that some of this optimism maybe can bleed through to you. Some of it maybe can bleed through from me, okay? And I know that that's really what Steve would have loved. And so I think that that's a great thing. I guess the last thing I'll say on that note is, if there's ever anything anyone needs here, there's someone listening. There's someone to help you, okay? And this is a great, wonderful place for that. So I just want to again say thank you so much for Steve, for the department, for the university, for everyone in attendance. It's really been my pleasure, my honor. And so I guess that's a great time to open it up for questions, comments, and any crazy ideas you may have. Thank you. Who would like to be our brave? Yes, Sarah.
Thank you. This is really interesting. Can you say a little bit more about the land back?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sarah had a question about the land back movement, and I guess to back up a little bit and explain that for people who maybe are unaware, land back is in part, well, it's an indigenous movement whose primary focus is to get the land back into the ownership of this nation's original inhabitants, okay? And this has been the course over history. That's why we have reservations, okay? But we can go a step further. And in a lot of cases, and in this case, of course, oftentimes when we put land back into the ownership of the indigenous peoples, that land thrives, right? They've been taking care of it since before my ancestors came to this country, okay? That said, right, there were, and this gets into the whole Indian law, part of why this is complicated and unfolded the way it did, some of these tribes actually went through termination, okay? So in the, late 1800s, I believe, don't quote me on that, the U.S. policy at that time was to get rid of Indians. The way you get that is to get rid of Indian as an identity, okay? And so they tried to actively terminate tribes and remove that identity so that they were just fully assimilated. Now we don't have to deal with any of those problems, okay? As a result of, I guess, more positive outlooks on that, tribes got their land back, okay, in a variety of ways. Some tribes got federal status and got land as a result. Other tribes found different ways to argue for certain rights that they had previously been granted, okay? And that's the case of these tribes. These tribes all had treaty rights to fish, okay? The U.S. government said you have a right to fish these waters. Okay? Now, they didn't necessarily ever specify how much fish, okay? Eventually, one of the agreements that they agreed, the U.S. said they have to have at least 50% access. Well, 50% of what, right? And so that then folds into, I think, a very interesting kind of way where this land is being returned, and what that is then is going to happen with that, right? It's not going to go into development. They're not going to put dams on it, right? They understand through their connection with the salmon that this is the best thing for everybody involved. I'm trying to think if there's another recent example that comes to mind. Not off the top of my head. Actually, no. Little Shell, Chippewa, which is in Montana, got a little bit of land a couple years ago, I believe, from the U.S. government. They were previously not federally recognized. Then they were. They got their bit of land. So it's something out there that's happening, and it's certainly on the more progressive side of leadings and kind of interpretations of that. Does that kind of answer your question, Sarah? Thank you. Who would like to go next? Rio.
The land obviously exists even when it's under, I think I can speak loudly enough. Land obviously exists even when it's under water.
Yeah.
Who owned it even when it was underwater, and did that change when it surfaced, or did they sell it or give it?
So my understanding is that the area that has been uncovered, revealed, disrupted, whatever, from these dam removals is all in the ownership of the tribal agreement that they kind of established as a private entity to manage it.
I guess my question is backing up a little bit. Was it like, did Pacificor?
So Pacificor would have was the original owner, right, of the dams, and so would have owned that land where the dams were located, right? I will say that my answer to your question, Real, will not really answer your question, and that it's much more complicated than that. And of course, when we get treaty rights involved, there's a lot of vague language that was intentionally used around who really owns the water, right? A lot of that was maybe not always negotiated in good faith, right? And so, of course, those original treaties didn't really think about water rights in the same way that we do today, or what's under the water. And so I think there's a number of things there where I probably can't give you a really sufficient answer to your question. So I apologize for that. Yeah?
Yeah, so you talked about the formation of coalitions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it is on. Okay, you have to hold it really close. So you talked about the formation of coalitions, and I'm curious more so like in the social aspect of your research.
Yeah.
How much of the, I guess if you were going to say success of this entire project would be attributed to the formation of coalitions, and how do you see them functioning into the future now that the dams are gone?
That's a great question. I think that the coalitions played an integral part in any of this happening. The fact that to some extent they were trying to get a jump on these things after the fish kill in a way that would move faster than the powers that be would respond to what had happened. Of course, you're always going to have people arguing against to some degree, no, what's going to happen with all that sediment? No, I don't want to lose my lakefront property, and are you going to reimburse me when it's no longer lakefront property, right? There were a lot of very immediate financial concerns from basically everyone involved, and part of the earlier coalition building, they actually came to an agreement at one point in time where Pacific Court would leave basically the situation and would let the coalition deal with everything that was left. It was actually the US government that stepped in and said, no, Pacific Court, you've made such a bad mess of this, you have to stay a part of this until this is finished, and you have to foot the bill. So I would be cautious in saying how much the coalition really led to the ultimate result, the end result, right? A lot of it comes down to the legal system, unfortunately. But I do think that it was, in my research and in looking into this, I do think it was really important in kind of healing old wounds, old bad feelings that they had amongst themselves. A lot of the early discussions, because again, you've got peoples at different part of the rivers, different interests at different part of the rivers, right? And so while the Yarok were really immediately concerned about the salmon, right? People higher up are worried about farming and irrigation. They're worried about hydroelectric energy production to some extent, right? And so I don't know if that's a great answer to your question. I think there's certainly positive aspects to glean from this. And that's where I would certainly like to err on, is that there are positives from this that I would like to take away. Again, I don't think that this is a model that works for every other situation, because they're all going to be unique and different. That said, building coalition, building community, I heard in a lot of conversations that once people sat down and kind of said what they were concerned about, they realized that they were all concerned about the same thing, the water. And once they could kind of get to that place, then that allowed them to maybe move historical wounds to the side a little bit, or try to be like, maybe these aren't the bad people that I thought they were. I do also think that there's a generational component in this, right? The original people who started those farms and had immediately benefited from that irrigation, and then things have kind of changed in Oregon, right? Things have changed in California. You had a lot of logging industry historically in Oregon, and that's been significantly reduced in a lot of ways. And so that puts other pressure on other interests, and I don't know. Anyone else in the back there? Got a couple.
I was hoping you could speak to if the salmon are capable of reintroducing themselves, or if they're reliant on hatcheries. And to that end, when they're back in these waterways, are the riparian areas surrounding these waterways healthy enough to act as viable spawning grounds?
So it's my understanding that they're not going to use any kind of fisheries to substitute or add into the population. They're just going to, I don't want to say they're just going to hope, right? But I think they're going to rely more on the fact that, salmon have been doing these things for generations upon generations upon generations. They know where to go. They know what to do. It's just about providing them the access and the opportunity ultimately, right? Will there probably be in this next year? Is it immediately going to bounce back to tons of salmon? Absolutely not, right? And maybe in the first year or two, it actually maybe won't look that great because everything's still coming out and there's a lot of nastiness in there, right? If I can't get in the lake up by where I'm at, and that's 400 miles of river, you got a lot of toxins in there to flush out. That said, hopefully, right, once that's kind of run its course, the salmon, and not only the salmon, right, but steelhead, you've also got lamprey, which is actually really cool, right? Those are the guys with the suckers that attach onto things, and all of those things are part of the subsistence lifeways of those tribes, And so the hope, of course, is that that will kind of cascade into effects and that all of those things will get better with time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a hand back there.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. So we know that you mentioned the reframing, the reclaiming, and we know restoration as one of those has a lot of narrative, weight, and people really have seemed to have taken to restoration as a framing for a lot of this, with both the rights and also these ecosystems that were lost or degraded. But you're also talking about things that have kind of never before been seen, like new agreements, new land, new places that haven't been managed. Like, I don't know if this estuary was historical, but can you talk about the ways people have made those narratives, whether there's this narrative of returning or whether there's this narrative of kind of moving forward into novelty? What's really being talked about out there, and how are people squaring the two of those?
Great question, and I appreciate that. I think there's a fair mixture of what you expect to hear: restoration, reclamation. Where's my little synonym list I made? Reclaim, restore, rehabilitate, rejuvenate, revival. I heard, and from one individual. I think part of that question depends on who you're going to ask, right? I think if you ask tribal members, they're probably going to say that this is in part a reclamation of that area, of our relationship, of the salmon, right? But I think maybe if you were to ask more ranchers and farmers, maybe it's more of it's restoring, it's restoring the river. I guess reviving kind of has a ring to it. I personally don't, I'm unsure of that language. I don't know, I'd ask you, what do you think of some of those different options?
Well, I know, some of these ecosystems are seeing conditions that are not even historic, and so it's sort of difficult to know how restoration fits into these things, and then, some people don't resonate as much with a return to historic rights if they're resistant to that, and maybe it makes more sense to look forward. But I'm just, curious to know what people are talking about, so I think, your answer helps.
I think it's really interesting, and it reminds me of a conversation I was having with Dr. Larson last night when he was talking about how all of the language around fire management is changing. You can't say certain things anymore, and so you've got to find new language to describe what you're doing, even though what you're doing is what you've always done, right? I can't remember any examples off the top of my head, of course, but I think it will be interesting to see, like you said, what takes hold, what kind of gets some momentum behind it, what gets financial backing behind it might be interesting in terms of in different ways and in different parts of the river. That's going to look very different. But it's absolutely something to keep your eye on, right? Thank you. Joel.
We're on TV, so I think it's on.
Yep.
So thinking about that whole idea, and I know from spending some time there, the language of we are the first best caretakers of the land. I think it would be interesting to look at traditional stories of that land before when the water was there, and then to see how they have to adapt that knowledge and relationship. That would be a really interesting discourse study for you to look at what are they reseeding and why, and what's the meaningfulness of that. Like, is it bear grass, or what else is it?
Absolutely.
First foods.
I think that's 100% something to keep an eye on, right? And I'm also even thinking, and this, of course, is another project which someone else has thought of or is investigating. We have a number of scholars here who are very interested in fire, right, and what that means. And we have students here who are interested in fire and what that means, and I think that's great. Fire gets really tricky, right? And I think when you then involve indigenous peoples in part of that process, fire looks very different, right? I was reading a little bit of research the other day with fires and prescribed burns down in the redwoods, right? And basically, everyone is now of a different mind of what you should do. Some people are saying, oh, well, the indigenous peoples used to go in and do controlled burns, but what about this or that? And so it's evolving, that discourse, and I think that's absolutely something to keep an eye on.
Right, because I've heard folks talking about restore back to when, which period in time. So rather, maybe it's more about taking that relationship and knowledge of the land and then looking where they go forward. So,
Absolutely.
There I advocate renewal, but I'm biased.
I like it. Thanks, Joel. Anyone else?
Oh, me, I guess.
Okay, perfect. Megan.
Eean, thank you also for making this into a dialogue. This is really fun. I think this is really interesting in the context of you can see some of the parallels with the kind of coalition of the 5 tribes that worked to, reclaim quite a bit of the area around what is now Bears Ears. Was Bears Ears.
Yep.
I don't really know how that ended. It wasn't great. But yeah, with the expansion of Grand Escalante and then Bears Ears National Monument area, but the kind of discourse around that was very much framed in the context of, a little bit of the kind of land back, or at least land management in the hands of the tribes, but then very much loss for a lot of the farmers and ranchers and recreation folks, because there's something about looking at federal land and saying that it is now lost.
Totally.
Anyway, and what I think is really interesting about this is we're looking at land that is returning, land that hasn't been seen for generations, both along those riverbeds, but also that estuary land that has been underwater for, longer than I've been alive for sure. And this is much more of a kind of a conversation that I think inspires, like, there's a gain here. We have more land. We have more land that we can share, and also we're getting the river back, and therefore we can kind of share that. But then from this discourse analysis perspective, we're still looking at different definitions, right?
Absolutely.
How do we define fishing? How do we define the value of fishing? How do we define, what is a gain versus a loss, right? As Joel said, this idea of restore to when. Well, some people lost their nasty toxic lake, right?
Exactly.
But for everybody else, there's all these new places where we could go hiking and could go camping and could be. And I'm just really curious what you think about kind of what is it going to look like as those guess what the future looks like, Eean.
Love it.
Some of the possibilities for this ongoing discourse is, where do you see some positive ways in which people can come together over shared definitions, and where do you think there's some possibilities for some friction as people are looking at different understandings of what we're regaining or not?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Megan, and it makes me think of a couple different things. The first is, of course, there's competing discourses, right? And it's more, I think, over the terms or over what they're doing together, right? It's interesting to think about that kind of loss versus the gain, in that I will admit, at least in what I've read and seen, the losses are of a much lower quantity than the gains across the board. And so it seems to me that although those losses are there, right, again, there's criticisms, of course, you can find those even from tribal members themselves, right? But there's enough people talking about the potential gains that at least seems like it's winning out. Now, what does that really look like, and how is that going to play out in each of all of those different ways? I'm not really sure. Again, I think it will probably be growing pains in a number of ways for different communities and how they want to navigate that. One of the tribal members that I found and was looking into, who was Karuk, was actually very much against ever doing a coalition. He was like, over my dead body. This will never happen. I don't trust you, right? You want to restore the wilderness, and we've always been here, right? Like, there's these other very, very deep-seated wounds that aren't going to resolve themselves easily. And yet, there's been at least enough focus on the positives and the potential positives that, again, I am encouraged by what I have been seeing. And although I know I don't get to come back and do another one of these, I will be sure to keep you informed over the next X years as things change around where I am in Klamath Falls, right? Some of those lakes and those water areas are necessary for a large number of our migratory birds, in addition to the salmon that go through there, right? And so this is something that I think is going to be hopefully a nice little gold star to look at and go, what new, interesting, cool stuff is coming out of the Klamath River? And I hope that's true. Yeah. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve.
What kinds of lessons have you learned about how coalitions were built? Like, what kinds of processes were involved? What kinds of communicative strategies were involved in getting groups who had opposing goals together to work on this endeavor?
That's a great question, and it makes me think of a couple things. One of the things that it makes me think of, and this is maybe not a direct response to your question, but it's kind of where my mind went, was, again, it has to do with generational discourses. Some of the stuff that I found was people who married into this huge ranching family and then found out what that was doing to the river or downstream or to these other people. And then they were maybe not so comfortable with that reality. And though they started to try to reach out and go, hey, I'm now part of this thing, but this doesn't really sit right with me. And talk to family members and go, okay, you know, that's the way things were, but the world changes, right? Change is the only constant. And so given that that's the case, well, let's go try to have a conversation with this individual and see if, you know, we can have a polite dialogue, right? I imagine lots of unpolite dialogue as well, right? Like this is very much an issue that is near and dear to everyone involved in this. But that's kind of where I go, Steve, is that there's something interesting there that is maybe when you don't have that immediate stake in the game, it makes it easier to let go of some of that. I don't know. There's something there. But I could probably explore that and look into that a little bit more. Thank you, absolutely. Megan, did you see another hand?
Well, it's going to be me, right? There's a different hand.
Oh.
Someone should take it.
Is there a hand back over here?
Oh, thanks, guys. Yeah, I just kind of building off of that, this idea of where are you seeing kind of, I guess, like allies finding one another, right? Looking at recreational and also commercial fishermen and then also tribal fishing rights, right? You're seeing this kind of, oh, here's something where we agree, even if the solution isn't something that we have worked out yet or something that we have the same ideas about, right? But this brings back, Greg and I were talking about the spotted owl last night, right? And this idea of, again, these, I guess, less official kind of coalitions, but more like allyships where it's, oh, okay, well, yeah, folks who are interested in protecting particular habitat because there's a specific animal that lives there, right? As well as people who are interested in protecting that habitat because they live there, right? And then also the people who fish and who have to live in these spaces all kind of came together to be like, oh no, it actually does matter that we keep the old growth, right? And so I'm really curious as you're looking at specifically fishing and the idea of, you know, so much of culture and also multiple cultures are centered around the salmon.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what kind of conversations are starting to come out of this or that you've seen so far?
So I will say as far as like the commercial side of the fishing, I'm not, you know, my focus in coming to this project is certainly from the indigenous perspective, right? The Native American cultural side, that's my background and that's kind of my primary area of interest. That said, I do think that there's, right, interesting things to be said around fishing. If we get into, you know, native law and fishing rights, that often means when Native peoples get to express those rights, they have to do so in traditional ways. That's one of the hang-ups that they still get. And so what does that mean? Well, they have to use traditional nets. They have to use traditional canoes. They're not allowed to use anything that's been made in the 20th century because their fishing rights are linked to that traditional practice. And so like the macaw up off the peninsula, right, they have traditional whaling rights still. They can go out and hunt whales, but they have to do it traditionally. Now, does the large majority of people care whether they do it traditionally or not? No, they just don't want whales killed, right? But I think that does get, that discourse is produced with different context in mind, right? The Klamath at one time actually fought Fish and Wildlife rangers on the river because the rangers were trying to prevent them from fishing. And so they're out there, getting hit, getting thrown around in the river. They've got their fish clubs or whatever. And so it was very violent. It was very brutal. And yet maybe as newer generations are less connected to that, they're able to let some of that go and see, fishing is a positive for all of us. Are they going to disagree about how much fish? Absolutely. I can absolutely guarantee that once salmon get back up to big numbers, they're going to have a disagreement about how much and who, right? Because there's different people on different chunks of the river. But at least for the time being, right, they're all on that positive of there is no fishing without the river. And the river, if we think about spotted owl again, the river is that home to so much more than just the salmon, right? If it's home to potential hundreds of native plant species, but also other fish, right? That's a much huger renewal restoration project than just saving the salmon. And so again, I think there's some hope to be optimistic. One more?
So kind of building on that last question, with these unknown estuaries that had kind of come up after the dams were demolished, how has that impacted access to the river, both commercially, recreationally, and tribally?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I do know that when the dams were still there, access was restricted. Right, I talked a little bit about how commercial fishers and yarrock fishers were banned, right? And that would have been the whole, basically, mouth of the river. Can you restate your question for me one more time?
Yeah. How do the, I guess, like unknown estuaries impact river access?
Okay.
Specifically more towards like fishing.
Absolutely.
And,
so previously there was restricted access on certain parts of the river, and there is also restricted access in certain parts of the river that are only tribally accessible, right? I think one of the interesting things that makes me think of is that, again, in kind of this hope and look towards optimism and positivity, right? The Karuk tribe has in recent years started offering tours of the river. They take you out in traditional canoes, that there's only a handful of, and only a handful of people can make them, and actually show you the river and try to, share some of their knowledge of what that access looks like, right? And so, again, I'm hopeful that this will allow more people to access the river, to enjoy the river, and that will just continue to build more and more capacity, right? Of course, we worry about what happens when then everybody wants to visit it, right, and turn it into a national park or something. But I think we're at least a few years off from that. So thank you for your question. We got one hand way back there. Yeah. Say that last part for me again. So I believe, and again, don't quote me on this, I want to say this last year was their 61st, okay? But for the last couple of years, again, they haven't been able to provide their own salmon or enough salmon. They've brought it in from Alaska or other places and kind of substituted that, right? But for the yarrock, who are people of the salmon, that's really not going to be okay, right? And so they've very much been a big part of that, finding other creative ways to celebrate the salmon despite not having salmon, right? And if you if you've never had smoked salmon, please go try smoked salmon. Right? There's a reason why we love this stuff. There's a reason why it's like chocolate. Okay? And so yeah, they've been doing it for that long, and I think that is also building to become something bigger. Thank you.